Hi milers. In this video I go over the way I made the benches for the poop deck. This is part 18 of my Trumpeter 1 to 200 scale Titanic build series. With the poop deck now glued to the hull, I can begin to add the final details to it. So the next step was to add the 18 benches that sat on the poop deck. Now the benches I used are from the Ponto's kit. They are smaller than the photo etch benches that came with the Trumpeter kit. For some reason the Trumpeter benches are too big and out of scale for this model. They are also do not have the center bench supports that were part of the original benches found on the Titanic. In order to bend the benches correctly to the right shape, I bought a set of jigs from shapeways.com. Now the actual link is shapeways.com/shops/northeast-model-designs. The product name is Ponto's Deck Bench Tool Kit, and it sells for about $24.95. The photos show the 4 pieces that come in the kit, and one can download the instructions from the website. The modeler will also need to make some kind of vise or have some kind of vise to hold the jigs in place, as the picture here shows. So here's a little close-up of these jigs. You have the one jig here where you would set your flat photo etch piece into, and then you just take the matching or corresponding jig and just sit there and just press it into shape, and then they're just shaped in such a way that you just have to press down. You just use like medium pressure, don't have to use a lot of pressure. Again, remember these are fragile photo etch parts you're going to be using, so don't over stress them. Just use as much force as you have to get the job done. And we got, this jig here I call the basically the primary jig. It's the widest one, and then there's another one that's thinner, and this one I'll call the assembly jig, and I'll talk about this in just a little bit. You will note that the 2 pieces shown in the picture represent 2 different stations in the bending process that I made. You will also note that the 2 jigs clamped into the vise are different widths, so I used the plastic strip to make up the difference so I could clamp both jig parts in the vise at the same time. The jig with the flat photo etch bench is the primary jig, or the bench shaping step. This jig is the width of the bench. The jig with the shaped bench upside down is where the center and the side supports are put in place and glued. This is the assembly jig. This jig is narrower than the bench, and the instructions explain why there is a difference between the widths of the jigs. Now before I begin the bending process, I did anneal or heat treat the photo etch benches as the instructions recommended, so they would stay in their bent shape better without a lot of rebending or overbending to keep the correct shape. Remember that these are fragile parts and will not take a lot of rebending. Alright, so let me show you the process I did to shape the benches. First, I laid the flat bench properly into the primary jig with the side support still attached to the bench. Then next I took the matching jig and pressed the bench into the vise held jig to form the shape of the bench as shown in the picture. The bench is now bent at the correct position and angle. With the 2 primary jig pieces holding the bench in place, I bent the side rails or supports as shown in the picture. Since the width of the primary jig is the same as the bench, bending the side supports until they were up against the sides of the primary jig got them close to the proper position they needed to be in with one bending motion. Next, I moved the bench slightly up and down on the primary jig and used a pencil to make the secondary bends to the bench's top and bottom sections to get a slight curve on the bench where the knees would sit, and at the top of the bench where the back would sit on these benches if they were normal sizes. The picture shows the bench with all of the curves finished and ready to move to the assembly jig for gluing the supports to the bench. As one can see in the picture, the side supports do not quite line up, resulting in the bench sitting a little crooked. Thus, some final adjustments will be made in the next step to get all supports in line with each other. So next, with the bench upside down and taped to the assembly jig, I glued the center support first. Now, I glued the center support first because once it's glued, it cannot be adjusted in any way. And I used the center support's glued position as the reference for the side supports to match. This way, the bench will not sit crooked when done. Now, while the glue is setting, I just get another flat bench ready on the primary jig and start the process all over again. Now, I did try to make some benches as the instructions recommended, namely by bending the bench without these side supports attached. So here's what a bench would look like with none of the side railings attached, and this is how they come in the photo etched tree with the side rails attached. But I found that this was much more difficult and time was consuming than bending the benches with the side supports still attached. Now you can decide which approach suits your skills. Now the next pictures show the extra steps I needed to do to do this without the side railings attached. So after gluing the center support to the bench, I had to take the jigs out of the vise and reposition the assembly jig sideways to glue the side support to the bench one at a time. Now, when setting the side support in place, I had to make sure that it lined up with the glued center support. With one side done, I had to reposition the jig again to glue the other side support. And again, I had to make sure that the side support being glued lined up with the other two supports so the bench would not sit crooked. Now this approach could be used if a modeler broke a side support off accidentally and had to glue it separately. And this next picture here shows the end result using both methods. And using both methods, you know, they look like they come out the same. I guess one could argue that by separately gluing the side support railings to the side of the bench one at a time, you could probably get a better gluing of these parts to one another, but to me they look just as good doing it with attached as without being attached. The final step was to paint the benches brown and the support rails black. The picture shows all the 18 benches painted and in place on the poop deck. Now, in the last video I said I was going to show how I was going to bend the railings for the poop deck, but the method I thought of did not work out as I thought it would, and so I decided to install the railings at a later date. So in the next video, I will go over how I made the Ponto's Photo Etched crane booms and an idea on how to light up the aft mast. So until the next video, have a great day.